Well, good morning. It is really wonderful to be able to worship with you all today, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here with you. I want to start this morning by telling a little story. Imagine with me that we are camping together in the woods. We spent the evening around the campfire, roasting marshmallows, singing songs, telling some stories, and now we're all sound asleep in a tent. Everything is calm and peaceful until a grizzly bear realizes someone brought the graham crackers, chocolate, and marshmallows to bed with them. The bear is about to charge our tent. In that moment, who is our leader? This is a story that I've heard one of my mentors, Willie Baptist, tell over and over again. Willie is the poverty scholar in residence at the Cairo Center at Union Theological Seminary and has been organizing for decades among the poor and homeless. He talks a lot about leadership. And in this story, he would say our leader is the first person to wake up. In that moment, other qualifications don't really matter very much. It's not the person who is the best looking or the most articulate or the wealthiest. It's the person who can identify that there is a grizzly bear outside and can wake us up from our slumber. We are living through a time in our nation that calls out for leadership. The news is full of stories of crisis, from families being torn apart at our southern border, to unarmed black people being shot by the police, to record high temperatures across the globe, to the disruption of our democratic process by a foreign power. A lot of people I know are feeling discouraged and even hopeless about the state of the world right now. Maybe you are too. And it can seem enticing to tune out, to curl up in our sleeping bags in that tent and roll over and go back to sleep. But there's a big bear outside, and our survival depends on waking up. So who then are our leaders? Who has already awoken to the problems we are facing and therefore can help us chart a course out of them? The most obvious answer is those closest to the bear, those who have been most directly impacted by the injustice and violence of our society and know firsthand their impacts. Last year, the Labor Religion Coalition of New York State, the organization I direct, held a series of truth commissions on poverty in New York State. And we did this in order to listen to people in our state who are experiencing poverty and racism and other injustices. We started out with 3 public events, kind of public hearings, one in Allegheny County, down in the rural southwest part of the state, one in Schenectady in the capital region, and one on Long Island. We heard dozens of stories about the struggles of our neighbors. For example, a young man in the Southern Tier told how he was forced to plead guilty to something he didn't do because he couldn't afford cash bail and would be stuck in jail if he fought the charges. A woman on Long Island who leads an organization that feeds hungry families testified about how she ended up in a homeless shelter when she got cancer and didn't have health insurance. A fast food worker in Schenectady talked about the struggle to provide for her kids while making $10 an hour. The 82 people who shared testimony at these truth commissions presented a very different picture of New York State than we often hear from pundits or from our elected officials. As much as some people would like to portray New York as progressive and prosperous, or to dismiss the poor as lazy or just down on their luck, the people we met proved otherwise. They powerfully challenged the conventional wisdom that says the political, economic, and social system in our state is basically working okay. This morning's reading from 1 Corinthians also speaks to a clash of worldviews, in this case between the gospel proclaimed by the early church and the dominant political and religious views of the day. The Apostle Paul describes those in the early Christian movement in Corinth in this way: "Not many by human standards were wise, not many were powerful, not many were from the upper class." And this community of outsiders preached an outsider message, which Paul says is confounding to the conventional wisdom of the day. To those with political and social and economic power, the message of a crucified Christ is foolishness and a stumbling block. How could a crucified man, one who had suffered Rome's most excruciating and humiliating punishment, be revered? How could someone so wretched be called the Son of God? And how could a crucified Christ be understood as good news? For those invested in the Roman system, who trusted that those whom the system crucified were indeed expendable, this gospel doesn't make any sense. But for those on the receiving end of Roman oppression, it was different. The early church, a community that included the poor and the outcast, knew the world's wisdom to be convoluted and inadequate and often violent. So for them, Christ crucified was good news. In Jesus' death, they saw the perversity of the Roman Empire's values laid bare. God took on human form, and the imperial powers tried to put God to death. The cross is a radical affirmation of the experience of the empire's victims. It acknowledges a system so broken that even God's Son, maybe especially God's Son, is vulnerable. And there is power in that revelation. In that revelation that in Jesus, God chose to take a firm stand, not as part of the systems and structures of this world that are killing people, but as part of the multitude being killed. The cross proclaims to the victims of empire that God is with us, even to the darkest, most humiliating, most painful places we could ever go. And incredibly, the gospel also proclaims that's not the last word. Jesus rises and returns not to conquer or seek revenge, but to promise that Christ's presence will never leave us. No earthly power or act of violence can separate us from God's love. This gospel of Jesus Christ identifies and responds to the grizzly bear of political, racial, and economic domination. In Paul's words, it also shames and makes foolish that conventional wisdom that upholds or ignores these systems of domination and their casualties. This is as true in our time as it was in Paul's. This morning we're gathered in a city, a state, and a nation which bears all too many similarities to Rome when it comes to social, racial, and political and economic inequality and the use of force to maintain it. As I'm sure many of you know, Syracuse has the worst concentration of poverty among Black and brown residents in the nation. Buffalo and Rochester are actually not far behind. New York consistently has the highest income inequality in the country, with 3 million people living below the federal poverty line and 44% of households earning less than the cost of basic living expenses in their area. More than half of the children in our state are poor or low income. This past week in Troy, not far from where I live, the police announced that an officer who shot an unarmed young black man last summer will face no consequences. And right now in the Albany County Jail, there are more than 300 immigrants detained on behalf of ICE, while even the sheriff acknowledges there is no reason for them to be incarcerated. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. taught us that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The system of domination and exploitation is the grizzly bear attacking us and attacking our neighbors. And a lot of our so-called leaders don't seem to notice or care or talk about it very much. But we are waking up. Across the United States, people directly impacted by these injustices are organizing and taking action and awakening thousands of others to the urgency of these struggles. This May and June, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, launched throughout the country with 6 weeks of action in over 35 state capitals and Washington, D.C. Here in New York, about 1,400 people from throughout the state participated in actions in Albany at our state capitol to call attention to the impacts of systemic racism, poverty, militarism, and ecological devastation. At our rallies each week, hundreds gathered to listen not to politicians or policy experts, but to the true leaders in this time, the people directly impacted by the systems of oppression that threaten our families and communities. We heard from the homeless, immigrants, the formerly incarcerated, low-wage workers, and those impacted by racism, transphobia, gun violence, war, and pollution. This campaign is just getting started, and I'll be talking more about it after the service for those of you who are able to stay. But fundamentally, it's about bringing together directly impacted leaders and other people of conscience to end these systems, to end systemic racism, poverty, militarism, and ecological devastation. And the premise of the campaign is that those who have woken up to the threat of these systems are our leaders. And if we can recognize our commonalities as human beings and work together in solidarity, that we can be successful in building that kind of world that the prophet Isaiah talked about, that we might see our light shining in the darkness and live in a world of justice and peace. This is gospel work. Faithful to our call to preach good news to the poor and release to the captives. It's work that resonates with the wisdom of the cross, that turns the logic of the world upside down. In these times of turmoil, God is calling us to be awake, truly awake, to both the suffering and injustice in our midst, and also to the ways that the good news is being lived out all around us. And once we're awake, we're called, as Willie Baptist would say, to be leaders. We're called to help shake other people from their slumber. By ordinary human standards, maybe not many of us are wise or powerful or from the upper classes. But even we, especially we, can be witnesses to the good news of justice, healing, and love for all who've been excluded and oppressed. Thanks be to God.